So hi everyone in the meeting. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Alba Rivas. If you don't know me, I'm a developer advocate at Salesforce. And in today's session, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself. I also want you to collaborate during the session. If you want to ask me anything, you can unmute yourself, no problem with that, or you can write questions on the chat window. I'm going to be taking a look at that. But also here you have my contact details in case that you want to ask me anything later in a date in the future, because maybe today you are a bit busy. Well, today I'm going to talk about how to start with Lightning Web Components open source and Node.js. We are going to see that Node.js is something that we use for bundling the files that you serve for Lightning Web Components, or when you create a Lightning Web Components open source application. And that's the reason we're going to talk about Node today a bit. And I'm not sure which knowledge do you have about Lightning Web Components, but that is not going to be a requirement for this talk, because I'm going to focus on the process of building an application and creating the required files and folders and building the project and serving it. And I'm not going to focus in the way in which you write a Lightning Web Component, okay? So let me go to the next slide. Well, this is our favorite slide. As you probably know, this is a forward-looking statement, which just means that as Salesforce is a publicly traded company, you should make purchases of a stock based on the functionality that is generally available. But today we are going to focus just on something that is GA, which is Lightning Web Components. So no worries at all. So, okay, when you develop on the Salesforce platform, right, and you have a project with some files, some Lightning Web Component files that you want to run into your organization on the platform, right? What you normally do is that you push your code or you deploy your code to the organization, and then what happens is that the Lightning Web Components compiler is going to transform your files in something else, right? It's going to transform them in a lower version of JavaScript, really. It's going to bundle the CSS and HTML, and it's going to end up serving your files in the Salesforce environment, right? When we talk about Lightning Web Components open source, OSS stands for open source. Well, it's really the same version of Lightning Web Components that we are using on the platform. It's just a different name, but it's exactly the same library, the same code of Lightning Web Components that we are going to use. The difference is that we are going to deploy our code to a different platform, something that doesn't live on Salesforce, but something that lives in a different infrastructure. For instance, you can create a Lightning Web Components OSS app and deploy it to Amazon Web Service, or deploy it to Heroku, to Google Cloud, to GitHub Pages, wherever. A place in which you are going to be serving those files, but that is not tightly related to the Salesforce platform. That means that for what we are going to use the Lightning Web Component, what we are going to use the Lightning Web Components library for is to compile your code in the same way that the process, that when you deploy or push your files to a Salesforce organization, that is happening automatically, right? That is happening automatically here, and here this is something that we are going to have to do. Here I have another picture, which is a computer picture, because normally for development, what you are going to do is to compile your files into your computer, and you are going to serve those files locally in local hosts, right? So the best way to start with Lightning Web Components open source is going to this site, lwc.dev. If you go to lwc.dev here, let me zoom a bit. It's not working very well, the zoom, sorry. Okay, so in this site, you are going to find all the documentation to get started with Lightning Web Components development outside of the platform. You are going to find some instructions here to quickly scaffold a project. And if you go to guide, you are going to find all the documentation of how Lightning Web Components works outside of the platform. This documentation is almost the same that the documentation that you have in the developer salesforce.com site, right? Which is the documentation for Lightning Web Components on the platform. But there are some major differences that are going to be reflected in this version of the documentation. So it's important to go to this site here if you want to start developing outside of the platform. Then you have here also some links that can be helpful, as for instance, some courses that you can tackle to learn more, some trailhead modules that you can tackle, again, to learn more and expand your content about Lightning Web Components open source, and also some community places to which you can go and ask questions, because normally a lot of people is there trying to help you and trying to kindly answer your questions. If you go to recipes, here we have an implementation of the Lightning Web Components recipes application sample app that we have in the sample gallery, LWC recipes, okay? But this implementation is LWC recipes open source. So instead of using this repo here, which is the one that we deployed to the platform, there is an LWC recipes open source repo, which you can take a look here, right? That contains exactly the same recipes that you can build on the platform, or most of them, but built with the outside of the platform version. So this is the best way to start, right? So if I go to the main site, the initial page, you are going to see here that they tell you how to start creating an app, which is executing this node package, right, called create-lwc-app. Create-lwc-app is a package that a person from my team has created, Rene Wilkenmeyer, right? It's an open source tool that is going to help you scaffold a project in which you are going to use Lightning Web Components to create an application outside of the platform. npx is just a node command that you can use to run a package, and this is what we are going to do right now. So I'm going to copy this command, and I'm going to open a terminal in Visual Studio Code. Here I'm in Visual Studio Code, but you can do this from another terminal, right? So I'm going to navigate to my development folder, and now I'm going to execute this npx create-lwc-app command. I'm going to call this app Miamisburg Dev App. And we are going to see what this package does. So this package is a tool, really, that is going to help you creating an app, follow a step-by-step wizard, right? Step-by-step instructions in which you are going to be asked about different options, different configuration options to create your app. So for instance, here I'm going to, they are asking me if I want to use a simple setup. I'm going to say no. I want to use the complex one. Next, I'm being asked about the name for my app. I'm going to stick to the defaults. Then I'm being asked about the description for the app. Let's stick with the defaults. Again, the same for the author, right? And now it tells you to select a package manager. These are the two most popular package managers for Node. And I'm going to explain the differences in a second, but for now, I'm going to select NPM. Then I'm being asked which kind of app do I want to create. Here we have three options. Standard web application, progressive web application, and electron web application. I'm going to pick the first one, and I will tell you again the differences later. And here I'm being asked about the bundler that I want to use. The bundler is the tool that is going to merge the different JavaScript files of your code in one. And in the production mode case, it's going to minify your code so that serving the files is more performant. And for the bundler, I'm going to pick Webpack. Now you can decide if you want to create a JavaScript app or a TypeScript app. I'm going to pick the JavaScript option because I'm more familiar with JavaScript. And they also ask you if you want to create a basic Express API server. So why are they asking this? Because, well, Lightning Web Components OSS is used, or Lightning Web Components in general, is used to create the front end of an application, right? But there may be cases in which you want to have a server, an API server, probably for testing, right? And in those cases, you may want to scaffold the project with a test API server that helps you creating those endpoints that your application may need. But for now, I'm going to say no, because I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to need that for this sample app. So now, the tool is creating all the files that my Node project requires, right? And is installing all the packages that are required as well. And we're going to take a closer look to that in a second, right? So meanwhile, this finishes, I'm going to go back to the presentation. And I'm going to explain you something else about this tool. So what is going to happen now? So we have executed this app. This app is going to create my Node.js project. My Node.js project is going to contain a set of files that we use normally for, well, it's going to create an opinionated structure in which we use some libraries to lint your code, to format your code, and to make sure that your code is following certain standards, right? And we're going to see that in this Node project, all Nodes projects have a file called package.json. The package.json file is the file in which you define the configuration for your project. You are going to define the project name, description, author, all those things that the create-lwc-app tool asked us. And there you are going to define also the dependencies, right? In Node, we can define dependencies like production dependencies and developer dependencies, which are dependencies that you will need only for development. And the developer dependencies that are going to be set up by this tool are the next ones. So first, we are going to have a dependency with slint, which is the linter. The linter is going to ensure that we are following the expected JavaScript best practices in our Lightning Web Components code, right? It's going to statically analyze our code and tell us if we are doing something that is not allowed. Then we are going to get Husky installed. Husky is just a tool that helps you validate your code and perform some automatic steps when you commit your files to Git or when you push them to a repository. Then we're going to have also lint staged, which is just related to slint. And we're going to have very important LWC services. LWC services is a library that Rene has created, okay? LWC services is a package that is part of this app. And LWC services is going to be in charge of compiling your code with the Lightning Web Components library and bundling your code with either Webpack or Rollup. These are, remember, we had to choose an option. So one of these bundlers is the bundler that is going to be used by LWC services to compile your code and generate the static files that need to be served at the end by a server of your choice, right? LWC services also includes the all the jest configuration so that you have a way to unit test your Lightning Web Component files. And again, this is something that this structure is something that is opinionated, right? It's something that Rene considered it was a best practice, and everyone in the team considers it, right? And that is going to be set up this way if you use create-lwc-app to create your Lightning Web Components applications. But using create-lwc-app is not required. You could set up a custom configuration of your Lightning Web Components app without using create-lwc-app and use your own configuration and libraries set up, right? The final library that I have here on the list is Prettier. Prettier is a formatter, a code formatter that we love using, because if you are working in an environment in which you have several developers and you have an automatic formatter that applies certain rules to your code, it's going to be much easier to work with other developers and to be more productive, right? And consistent with what others do. So I said that when our application is created, the structure of files that gets created is a node project. And that is the reason because of which we need to understand a little bit of Node to start working with Lightning Web Components outside of the platform. But what is Node, right? So Node is basically a JavaScript runtime. Where else do you have JavaScript runtimes? In browsers, right? In the browser, you have a JavaScript runtime that is able to run your JavaScript code. This is Node is a JavaScript runtime. It's something that is going to be able to run your JavaScript code, but on the server, not on a browser. Normally, it's used to write backend code, right? And something important to know is that the web APIs are not going to be available when you use JavaScript in Node, right? Because web APIs are tightly related to browsers, not to backend code. Node JavaScript runtime is built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine, right? Just this as a curiosity. And for me, the most important feature of Node is that there are dozens and dozens of libraries available in package registries, right? If you are not familiar with NPM, NPM is one of those package registries and also the tool that you use to navigate and install packages from that database, right? It's a database of packages in which developers publish packages or libraries that you can download and use in your projects via that dependency JSON file that we have called package.json, the one that we saw before, right? Those packages are very varied, right? There are packages for working with databases, read and write files on your file system, creating a web server, and much more, right? But the ones that we are going to use in the context of Lightning Web Components applications are packages that help you to bundle your web application code, right? So now we're going to take a look at the different options that you can pick when you use Create Lightning Web Components app, and we're going to understand a bit more what a node project is and how we are setting up a node project using create-lwc-app. So if you remember, when I ran the tool, I had to pick between npm and yarn, right? npm and yarn are really command line tools that are going to help you manage your package dependencies. So for instance, if you want to install a package, an npm package, a node package, right? You can do npm install and the name of the package. Or if you are using yarn, you can write yarn add and then the name of the package. There are some differences between them, but at the end, the problem that they are going to solve and the functionality that they are offering is exactly the same. So npm was released earlier. It was released in 2010, so it's a bit more widely adopted. When you run npm install or yarn, that we're going to see in a second, that these are the commands to initialize your project and download all the dependencies, npm is going to create a file called package-log.json, while yarn is going to create a file called yarn-log, but it's more or less the same. And I'm not a super expert on Node, but what I have read, right, after investigating a bit more about these two package managers, is that npm is in general more lightweight, while yarn is in general a bit more performant, right? But there are people who love npm and there are people who love yarn. So it's very, very opinionated. So let's say that we want to initialize our project, right? So our application has finished downloading the modules and so on, right? Is ready. It's telling me that the Miamisburg dev app has been created here. So what I'm going to do is to open that app with code. Here in VS Code. And we are going to continue working in the app, right? So this is our Node project. Here we have all the files that I mentioned before. Here's our package.json with all the information that I set up in the create-lwc-app wizard. There is a section with the developer dependencies, the section that has the dependency with LWC services, etc., etc., etc. And as part of my or the build that create-lwc-app did, part of the work that create-lwc-app executed, right? The tool already executed a command called npm install, right? I'm not going to execute it again. This command is in charge of taking a look at the dependencies that you have specified in your package.json file, right? Developer dependencies, but also the production dependencies. And it's in charge of downloading those modules from npm. Right? So for instance, here I have a dependency with compression. That means that here in my node modules folder, I'm going to have a folder. Let me look for it. Oh, it's compression. Sorry, I was thinking about different library. Compression. Why do I... Here it is. Okay, so that means that in my node modules folder, I'm going to have a library called compression. There are many more libraries because this compression library has dependencies with other libraries and with other libraries and with other libraries. So there are many more libraries. And if we look, for instance, for the SLint dependency, which is a developer dependency, I'm developing, so it makes sense that this node module has been installed as well. So I can try to look for it. And here we have the SLint library, right? So that is one of the things that that npm install is going to do, or the equivalent command in Yarn. The other thing that this is going to do is to create my package log.json file, right? So normally, node projects have a package.json file. In this package.json files, we specify the dependencies. The dependencies normally always follow a syntax called semantic versioning, in which we specify the major version, minor version, and patch version. And normally they use a modifier, right, which can be a caret of a tilde or a tilde, that is specifying a range of versions. So this caret here means that this application is happy to use SLint version 7.1.1, for instance, from SLint version 7 release 00 to SLint version 7.9.9, right? All the possible versions in the major version, in the major version number 7, right? That means that depending on the versions that are available, when I run npm install, depending on the day and time that you run that command, a different set of versions may be installed, because maybe for a developer that runs this command today, the version 7.23 is installed, but maybe if I run it tomorrow, a new version is released and I install the version 7.24, for instance, right? So what does package log.json do? Package.log.json takes a picture of the exact dependencies that are installed in your application. So this is a much more accurate definition of what a developer is using in a specific moment, right? So it's a good idea to commit the package log.json file with your code, because that way another developer is going to be able to reproduce exactly your development environment. Indeed, once a project has a package log.json file and you run npm install, the npm install command is going to take a look at this file first before package.json. This one takes precedence and is going to download the versions that are specified here, not the ones in package.json. So that is important to understand. If you are using Yarn, instead of having a package log.json, you are going to have a yarn log.json, but the result is exactly the same. The npm install command is going to take a look at this file with more precedence than if you just have a package.json file. Great. So we have already initialized our project. We have all our dependencies loaded locally, right? Downloaded, really. And now the next step that we are going to do is to build our application. And for that, we're going to take a look at package.json again. Are there any questions so far? If you have any questions, please, yeah.
I'm fine for now. I'll ask my questions at the end.
If you want to ask your questions now, you are more than welcome.
So the node dot the node application that we're trying to build, right? This is specifically if we try to build the application for outside Salesforce.
Yes, exactly.
So apart from Node.js, are there any other languages that are also recommended?
Well, Node.js is not a language itself. The language that you use to run an application on the Node JavaScript runtime is JavaScript, right? Node is the runtime in which you are going to execute your application on the server side, right? And well, it's not that it is recommended to learn TypeScript because you can write your applications in JavaScript, but another option that you have to write your applications is to use TypeScript. Remember that in create-lwc-app, we had to select if we wanted to use a JavaScript application or a TypeScript application.
Right, yeah.
So if you want to get the benefits of using a TypeScript application, that's something that you can do in TypeScript. You have some benefits. Some people prefer to use TypeScript because it's strongly typed, right? And it's sometimes easier to write cleaner JavaScript code with TypeScript, and that may be an option, but it's not a requirement, right?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think we have one more question from Richard on the chat.
Okay. So I'm going to read the question aloud just for the recording from Richard. In your experience, do you make a Lightning Web Component app on the platform and then port it to Lightning Web Components OSS, or go straight to Lightning Web Components OSS? I tried porting a couple of months ago and found that some of the base components didn't render the same under OSS, mainly containers. Plus, creating wire adapters are quite difficult. Not worth the efforts versus just interfacing with databases directly. Okay, so I guess this depends on your use case, right? I know some customers who have created a Lightning Web Components application on the platform, and they have created a really nice component. And then they have another application, which is a customer-facing application running on Heroku, and they want to reuse the same Lightning Web component that they created on the platform. In that case, it may be a good idea to say, okay, I want to take this Lightning Web component and use it, port it, and use it outside of the platform, right? I also know some customers that are using Lightning Web components outside of the platform from scratch because their use case is that one, only because of that, right? And normally, applications are written because there is a use case behind them. And depending on the requirements, your business requirements, it may be interesting to create an application outside of the platform because you want to use a custom database, or because you want to run an application on Heroku and make use of horizontal and vertical scaling, right? Or because you want to create a progressive web application with offline management. But there are some other cases in which just having your application on the platform may be enough, right? On the platform, you have many tools that help you build a nice application very quick. For instance, declarative tools as a builder, flow, etc. So in some cases, if you don't have a strong requirement to go outside of the platform, I would keep within the platform, right? Regarding the problems that you mentioned, all those problems make sense, right? Well, the base components one doesn't make sense. I mean, the base components were open source in a beta status some time ago, and there may be some problems with them. What I recommend you to do in those cases is to try to log those problems and tell Salesforce, hey, this component is not working as I expected. Please prioritize it and fix it. And for the other problem that you mentioned, wire adapters, that is completely understandable, because wire adapters allow you to retrieve data, right? And when you run Lightning Web Components on the platform, you retrieve data from the Salesforce database. So all that configuration and infrastructure is set up for you. But when you run a Lightning Web Components open source application outside of the platform, you don't have a connection by default with Salesforce. And if you need data from Salesforce, you are going to need to set up all that manually, right? So that makes perfect sense. One option in that case would be to use, for instance, Heroku Connect and try to use the data from Salesforce through a Heroku Connect gateway, right? Something like that. That could be an option. But that increases the pricing of the application if you need to do it in an enterprise ecosystem. Hope that helps responding your question. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the demo. Glad that it is helpful. I'm going to continue with the demo. So here I am in the app that we have created. This is our package.json file. And as I mentioned, there is a scripts section. In this script section, you are going to find scripts that you can run with Node. And these scripts are there to help you building your application in production mode, building your application in development mode, building and watching your application. We're going to test them, these 3 commands in a second. And also doing some things as, for instance, linting your project, formatting your code, and running the unit test, right? We're going to take a look at the build commands because I think that those 3 are the most interesting to understand. So let's say that now I have created my application, npm install has run, all my modules have been downloaded and are here in my local copy, right? I have reproduced the environment that the last developer who committed this page, this file to the repo was using. And now I want to build my application. The build step is necessary because when you deploy to Salesforce, the build step is happening automatically behind the scenes. But when you run your applications outside of the platform, it is your responsibility to build the code. So here we have a command which is build. To run these commands, normally what you use, in my case that I'm using npm, you can do the same with John, is that you execute npm run and then the command build. When the build command is executing, what is happening behind the scenes is that this tool, right, really LWC services, which is the dependency that we have downloaded, is using LWC, the LWC library, to compile our code and is bundling it. If we take a look at the assets that are generated, they are going to be generated in a folder called dist. And in this folder, we are going to have the resources that our application uses. You are going to find an index.html file, which is the entry point for the application. And you're going to find a JavaScript file. If you notice here, this file is kind of difficult to read This is because this file is minified. This file contains all the JavaScript code that you have written for your applications in your Lightning Web Components and in the libraries that you are using and that are required by these components, but is minified in a format in which when I use this file in a real production environment, is going to be much more performant than if I have the file without expanded, right, without minimization. That is something important to understand. So basically, the static files that are generated are these ones. If we take a look at index.html, you are going to find that at some point here we are importing the JS file that has been generated, and that's it. This is our app. This is the same resulting code that your Salesforce organization serves when you are running a Lightning Web Components application there. But this time, we are the ones who have compiled the code and bundled it to create this final application, right? Once you have compiled your Lightning Web Components, there is another command that you can use to serve those files, which is the serve command, npm run serve, right? And this is going to serve your files in localhost, like for development. This is the app that we have created, the contents of the app that comes by default. And here, if we take a look at the app, this is no more that the JavaScript file that we have compiled, that we have bundled, and that we have minified, and that we are serving here, right, in the index.html file. But this is what you would do like for production, right? Like creating the production version of your JavaScript application and serving it. But we are not going to do that normally for development. For development, what we are going to do normally is you have two options, right? One of the options is to build your application in development mode, and you are going to see the differences. Our build has finished, and let's take a look now at which resources have been generated in our this folder. Is this JavaScript file here? You can see that now the code is much more readable. And we have also a map file. So what is this map file for? So if you think about it, when we debug our Lightning Web Components files, we love taking a look at them in Chrome Developer Tools and adding breakpoints in the debugger and so on, or doing the same here in VS Code Debugger, right, and adding breakpoints. The map file is going to help mapping the lines. It's a definition of the lines that belong to the initial file that you wrote, the JavaScript code that you wrote, and the line in which that specific statement is placed in this JavaScript file here. Having the code unminified is going to help us very much in debugging, in terms of debugging, because we are going to be able to set up these debug breakpoints, and we're going to be able to read the code much easily. If you pick this option for development, then again, you have to serve your files, and this is going to serve your files in localhost, but this time is going to be much easier to, is this one here? It's going to be much easier to debug your Lightning Web Components. Let me refresh this. Because you have the code like visible and readable, etc. And if I'm able to find here my Lightning Web Component code at some point, I can start adding breakpoints, right? That is very easy to do. If you are a debugger statement in your Lightning Web Component JavaScript file, then the debugger is going to stop exactly there. But For development, I prefer another option, which is using the watch mode. Sorry, let me open my VS Code instance again. So for the watch mode, npm run watch, what is going to happen behind the scenes is that your code is being built in development mode, but additionally, we are enabling a hot reloading feature. This hot reloading feature is going to rebuild your code every time that you change something in the code base. So, for instance, remember our application is really using a Lightning Web component, which is called app. And in this Lightning Web component, we have, for instance, a message that says, edit the app.html file and save for live reload. We're going to take a look at how this look like in the app, right? This message here. So now what I can do is to, in VS Code, change this. I'm going to save the file. I've clicked Command Save, and I can go to my Chrome here, Chrome instance. Oh, sorry, this didn't work because I didn't reload after executing the watch mode, but I'm going to do it again. So now I'm going to write here, hello, Alba. And this is running in watch mode. What is going to happen is that the page has rebuilt the application automatically, and it's refreshed the browser automatically as well. So this is very useful for iterating while you are developing Lightning Web Components applications. Great. So after that, if you remember something else I was asked about in the create-lwc-app wizard was which bundler did I want to use. The options were Webpack and Rollup. There are other bundlers out there, as for instance, Browserify and Parcel, but I know these two are like the most extended ones, and that is the reason Rene included them in the tool, right? Again, this is not an area I'm a super expert on, but I have been able to compile some conclusions from what I have read in some places, right? And basically, well, if you want to take a look at this table here comes from a report, which is a benchmarking in which the different bundlers have been evaluated in regards to different features and how they perform in regards to those features, right? And in summary, what this report says is that as of 2020, right, because these two bundlers have been evolving and changing with the time, some people prefer to use Rollup because in general it's like simpler to set up. It has a simpler API and it's really well documented. So some people prefer use Rollup that way, and also because the output that generates at the end is smaller, so it's going to be slightly more performant than is if you use Webpack. But Webpack is also more extended. Webpack was released before Rollup, some years before, and also is very well supported by the community. There are many plugins for Webpack out there that are built and maintained by the community that is interesting to use. So remember, a bundler is just the tool that we use to bundle our code in a single file, that file that we saw at the end, right? The one that our application is going to serve. And in some cases, you may want to use one or the other. Something else that we saw in that wizard was whether we wanted to use a standard web application, a progressive web application, or an electro web application. A progressive, well, standard web application is the one that we have created, right? When you create a standard web application, the project that is going to be generated is exactly the same that we saw, that hello world project, in which we have our index HTML and some sample Lightning Web Components, so that you can start from there. If you select a progressive web application, by the way, is an application that is able to run in any kind of devices, like a mobile device, for instance, or a tablet or whatever, that just uses HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and that has some requirements implemented, as for instance, offline management, right? So normally for these applications, to implement offline management, it is used something called service workers. And if you pick this option, the create-lwc-app tool is going to create the boilerplate code to create a service worker. So that's going to be a good start for you. And finally, if you want to create an Electron app, which is normally a desktop app that you create with HTML and JavaScript and CSS, is going to add also the boilerplate code needed, concretely the main.js file. So those are some options that you may be interested in if you want to work with Lightning Web Components OSS. Okay, so I explained everything about create-lwc-app because I think it's a great way to understand the different steps that you have to follow to set up, compile, and serve a Lightning Web Components application outside of the platform, right? But so that you know, create-lwc-app is not compulsory. You don't need to use create-lwc-app to scaffold a project. It's an option. It's a tool that is going to help you, but you can create LWC open source projects, create using your own bundler and your own setup. Here I have left you a link to an example of that project. This is an application built by one of the engineers from the Lightning Web Components team, Pierre-Marie Dartus. And this application hasn't been created with create-lwc-app. It's an application in which Pierre-Marie decided to use a custom roll-up configuration, and that's something that you can take a look if you want to, if you are more interested in understanding the guts of what a Node application and a Lightning Web Components open source application needs to have. Great. So during this presentation, we have talked all the time about LWC services, right? When we were talking about the project here, sorry, let me open VS Code again. When we were talking about package.json here, we talk about the dependency with LWC services. But remember, LWC services has a dependency with LWC. LWC is really the library that you need to use Lightning Web Components outside of the platform. And LWC is the library that we use on the platform, right? This is exactly the same library. It's not a different library. Some people believe it's a different one, but that is not true. You can subscribe. So this is open source. You can subscribe or watch the repository and be on top of the updates that the Lightning Web Components engineers are doing. I'm subscribed, and I realize many things when I receive emails from GitHub, because I know which features they are working on, and that is really nice. And also, Lightning Web Components is available as a node package on NPM. That way, it's very easy when you scaffold a project, a custom project, to include Lightning Web Components using the dependency management via your package.json file. Now I arrived to this, the question that Richard asked, which is a very interesting question, right? It's a good question. There are some major differences between LWC and Lightning Web Components or OSS that you need to know, right? First of all, as he mentioned, LWC, when you use Lightning Web Components on the platform, all the connection to your organization is set up, and you can use wire adapters to retrieve data from there. But if you are going to use Lightning Web Components outside of the platform, you will need to handle the authentication, and you will have to write your own wire adapters if you want to use the wire service. Okay, that is important to know. Another major difference is that on the platform, when you use Lightning Web Components, locker service applies. Locker service is a security layer that is going to prevent you from doing some stuff on the platform for security. But if you are using Lightning Web Components outside of the platform, it's your domain, so we don't run locker service, and we let you do whatever you want to do with your code and your data, right? If you are using Lightning Web Components on the platform, base components and the Lightning Design System are included, are available for you. You can use them out of the box. But if you use Lightning Web Components outside of the platform and you want to use base components or the Lightning Design System, it's your responsibility to include them. Luckily, that is very easy to do because we have NPM modules for that. So the base components are open source, right? And they are also published as an NPM package. So you can include a dependency in your package.json file so that your project downloads that package and uses that package on production mode. I mean, it's not a developer dependency, but a dependency, right? And the same happens with the Lightning Design System. The Lightning Design System is open source, and there is an NPM package that you can specify in your package.json dependencies so that it is included in your project code and so that you can use SLDS classes as you would do in the Salesforce platform. Finally, I wanted to mention that in LWC.dev, there is a section called RFCs. These are the RFCs, the requests for comments that are approved, after implemented, active, etc., etc., etc. These are the features in which the Lightning Web Components engineers are working on at the moment. And from there, you have the link to the specification of the RFC on GitHub, on the Lightning Web Components open source repo. And there you can take a look at what they are doing, but also interact, add comments, bring your own opinion to the table, and interact with the team. That for some people may be also interesting. To finish, I want to recommend some resources. There is a Trail Mix and a Trailhead project that are related to Lightning Web Components open source, and they are super fun and helpful. In the project, you build a conference app step by step, and you learn how to scaffold your project and deploy your components one by one, and you learn how to code Lightning Web Components also a bit for the platform, because it's the same kind of code even though you are using it outside of the platform. So it's super interesting. And I also recommend you 2 different blog posts. So the first blog post is a blog post that was released in December. And remember, I told you that you can use Lightning-based components and the Lightning Design System outside of the platform, but I haven't demoed how to do it. So if you want to know how to do it, read this blog post, because in this blog post, you have step-by-step instructions of how to include your Lightning-based components using NPM, and how to include the Lightning Design System using NPM, and how to set up everything so that you can use those 2 things outside of the platform too. There are some caveats as Richard mentioned, because there are some components that may not be available, or there may be some small issues with some of the components. But as I mentioned, the best thing to do is to report them, because sometimes we just don't know that that problem is there. And the other blog post is a blog post I wrote also on December, right? Because I wanted to get my hands up on with Lightning Web Components open source, and what I did was to write a Christmas application, because in my house we do something, it's a kind of game in which you earn credits and then you can spend those credits buying Christmas illustrations, and I wanted to automate that somehow. So here you have all my findings and learnings from that experience. I try to write the application from an enterprise perspective, like trying to follow the best practices, separating the front end from the back end, trying to create like a production environment and a development environment, right? And I found some interesting things, some learnings that I think was worth to share. And that is the reason I wrote this blog post, just in case you want to take a look. And with that, we have arrived to the end of the presentation. Let me know if you have more questions, please. You can unmute yourself or talk in the chat window, or add your messages in the chat window. I don't mind.
I took the screenshot of the links that you just posted on the earlier slide. I'll just post it in the event page also.
Okay, I will share the slides with you just in case.
Nice. Yeah, I can just post that on the event also. Yeah, looks
Okay.
like a lot of learning on the NPM.
Mm-hmm. There is, but at least I hope that you have, from this talk, you got an understanding at high level of what's a Node project, why do we need Node for Lightning Web Components open source, which is just for the development step, right? For the building step, we don't need it in production or anything. And the different, the possibilities that you have in this world, right? Because we open up the possibilities so that you can use any Node module of your choice, and we give you the full control of what you can do with your application.
So it's not only for the outside like Salesforce. It's even within the Salesforce we can still use the Node to build the applications, right?
Yeah. So when you span an application in Salesforce, I mean on the platform, it also uses Node, but normally it uses like for SLint or Prettier or whatever, something that you use in development. There is an initiative that I don't know when it's going to be released. I think it's not released yet, which is a feature that will let you use Node modules within Salesforce, within the Salesforce platform, right? But I think that is not available yet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all these days I was
But you can use them for development.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was just using the JavaScript to build the Lightning Web Components all these days, but I haven't explored the NPM or the Node yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but this was.
Thank you.
Hi, Alba. I'm Gautam here. I have few questions. So I worked with Node and also with JSForce. So to actually like connect to Salesforce and then get the data out. So I've installed the base components for the open source project. And so is it like I've never seen a custom wire, how you can connect the custom wire adapter to Salesforce directly using OSS. Is there any link that you can point me to so that I can learn a little bit more about it?
Yeah. Let me take note of that. And what I can do is to find some links and share them on the page for the event. Okay. Because I don't have the links at hand at the moment, but I have seen some documentation that I can share with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And we primarily use, I personally was to use the OSS because of the live reload. right? So if I have to use the standard LWC component, I have to deploy to Salesforce and then check whether it's working or not and things like that. We did, and previously when I used it, we'd never use scratch out. So we had sandboxes, so we couldn't check directly like on a live reload. So my option was to use OSS, build it, sort of understand what's going on JavaScript wise, and then later convert it into LWC.
Oh, nice approach. I didn't know. I didn't know about that approach. I strongly recommend you to try to move to Scratch orgs because you are going to get lots of benefits from them. But yeah, if that approach works for you for now, that's good to hear, right?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions?
I think good from my side.
Okay. So to finish, let me share just our social channels, right?